Prologue, Part 1. Mathematical being necessarily belongs neither among the first nor among the last and least simple of the kinds of beings, but occupies the middle ground between the partless realities, simple, incomposite, and indivisible, and divisible things characterized by every variety of composition and differentiation. The changeable, stable, and incontrovertible character of the propositions about it shows that it is superior to the unchangeable, stable, and incontrovertible character of the propositions about it shows that it is superior to the kinds of things that move about in matter. But the discursiveness of mathematical procedure, its dealing with its subjects as extended, and its setting up of different prior principles for different objects, these give to mathematical being a rank below that indivisible nature that is completely grounded in itself. It is for this reason, I think, that Plato assigned different types of knowing to the highest, the intermediate, and the lowest grades of reality. To indivisible realities, he assigned intellect, which discerns what is intelligible with simplicity and immediacy, and by its freedom from matter, its purity. And its uniform mode of coming in contact with being is superior to all other forms of knowledge. To divisible things in the lowest level of nature, that is, to all objects of sense perception, he assigned opinion, which lays hold of truth obscurely, whereas to intermediates, such as the forms studied by mathematics, which fall short of indivisible but are superior to divisible nature, he assigned understanding. Though second in rank to intellect and the highest knowledge, understanding is more perfect, more exact, and purer than opinion, for it traverses and unfolds the measureless content of knows by making articulate its concentrated intellectual insight, and then gathers together again the things it has distinguished and refers them back to knows. As forms of knowing differ from one another, so also are their objects different in nature. The objects of intellect surpass all others in their simplicity of modes of existence, while the objects of sense perception fall short of the primary realities in every respect. Mathematical objects, and in general, all the objects of understanding, have an intermediate position. They go beyond the objects of intellect in being divisible. They go beyond the objects of intellect in being divisible, but surpass sensible things in being devoid of matter. They are inferior to the former in simplicity, yet superior to the latter in precision, reflecting intelligible reality more clearly than do perceptible things. Nevertheless, they are only images imitating in their divided fashion the indivisible, and in their multiform fashion the uniform patterns of being. In short, they stand in the vestibule of the primary forms, announcing the unitary and undivided and generative reality, but have not risen above the particularity and compositeness of ideas and the reality that belongs to likeness. Nor have they escaped from the soul's varied and discursive ways of thinking and attained conformity with the absolute and simple modes of knowing which are free from all traces of matter. Let this be our understanding. For the present, or the immediate status of mathematical genera and species as lying between absolutely invisible realities and divisible things that come to be in the world of matter. To find the principles of mathematical being as a whole, we must ascend to those all-pervading principles that generate everything from themselves, namely the limit and the unlimited. For these, the two highest principles after the indescribable and utterly incomprehensible causation of the one give rise to everything else, including mathematical being. From these principles proceed all other things collectively and transcendently. But as they come forth, they appear in appropriate divisions and take their place in an ordered precision, some coming into being first, others in the middle, and others at the end. The objects of nous, by virtue of their inherent simplicity, are the first partakers of the limit and the unlimited. Their unity, their identity, and their stable and abiding existence, they derive from the limit. But for their variety and generative fertility, their divine and otherness and progression, they draw upon the unlimited. Mathematicals are offsprings of the limit and the unlimited, but not of the primary principles alone, nor of the hidden intelligible causes, but also of secondary principles that proceed from them in cooperation with one another, suffice to generate the intermediate orders of things and the variety that they display. This is why in these orders of being there are ratios proceeding to infinity, but controlled by the principle of limit. For number beginning with unity is capable of indefinite increase, yet any number you choose is finite. Magnitudes likewise are divisible without end, yet the magnitudes distinguished from one another are all bounded, and the actual parts of the whole are limited. If there were no infinity, all magnitudes would be commensurable and there would be nothing inexpressible or irrational. Figures that are thought to distinguish geometry from arithmetic could not features that are thought to distinguish geometry from arithmetic, nor could numbers exhibit the generative power of the monad, nor would they have in all their ratios such as multiple and super particular that are in things. For every number that we examine has a different ratio to unity and the number just before it. And if the limit were absent, there would be no commensurability or identity of ratios in mathematics, no similarity and equality of figures. For the limit to absent, there will be no commensurability or identity of ratios in mathematics, no similarity or equality of figures, nor anything else that belongs in the column of the beta. There would not even be any sciences dealing with such matters, nor any fixed and precise concepts. Thus mathematics needs both these principles, as do other realms of being. For the lowest realities, those that appear in matter and are molded by nature, it is quite obvious that at once they partake of both principles, of the unlimited as the ground that underlies their forms, and of the limit by virtue of their ratios, figures and shapes. It is clear then that the principles primary in mathematics are those that preside over all things. Just as we have noted these common principles and seen that they pervade all classes of mathematical objects, So let us enumerate the simple theorems that are common to them all. That is, the theorems generated by the single science that embraces alike all forms of mathematical knowledge. And let us see how they fit into these sciences and can be observed alike in numbers, magnitude and motions, such as the theorem governing proportion, namely the rules of compounding, dividing, converting and altering. Likewise, the theorems concerning ratios of all kinds, multiples, superparticular, superpartian and their counterparts, and the theorems about equality and inequality in their most general and universal aspects, not equality or inequality of figures, numbers or motions, but each of the two by itself having a nature common to all its forms and capable of more simple apprehension. The certainty and certainly beauty and order are common to all branches of mathematics, as are the methods of proceeding from things better known to things we seek to know, and the reverse path from the latter to the former, the methods called analysis and synthesis. Method of proceeding from things better known to things we seek to know, that is analysis, and the reverse path from uh, the latter to the former, synthesis. 10. The footnote says that is from premises to conclusions. The characteristic feature demonstration as postulated by Aristotle. I'll read this footnote too. On the Pythagorean doctrine of the two columns, see Aristotle. 10 members in each column as listed by Aristotle. Limit, unlimited, odd, even, one, many, right, left, male, female, rest, motion, straight, curved, light, dark, good, evil, square, oblong. The column on the left is better. Analysis seems to be like you're taking a subject that building up from the parts to see what forms, and synthesis seems to be seeking what synthesizes. From what we seek to know to things better know. I'm thinking of what the author means, because analysis sometimes means the straight opposite, like in the Kantian sense. Give me a moment, because I'm reading this for myself. Anyway, they just seem to speak of two directions of directions the awareness can move in understanding phenomenon, which is to take the known, the perceived, or the datum available, or what is axiomatic, and move to a perception of what is generated by, or to take an unknown perception and begin to see what it is synthesized out of, what it is made out of. So the term should actually flip if the literal meaning of the English terms are taken. That's why I was passing. Likeness and unlikeness of the ratios are not absent from any branch of mathematics, so we call some figures similar and others dissimilar. And in the same way, some numbers like and others unlike, and matters pertaining to powers obviously belong to general mathematics, whether they be roots or squares. All these Socrates in the Republic puts in the mouth of loftily speaking muses, bringing together in determinate limits the elements common to all mathematical ratios and setting them up in specific numbers by which the periods of fruitful birth and its opposite, unfruitfulness, can be discerned. Consequently, we must not regard these common theorems as subsisting primarily in these many separate forms of being, nor as later born and deriving their origin from them, but as prior to their existences and superior in simplicity and exactness. For this reason, knowledge of them takes precedence over the particular sciences and furnishes to them their principles. That is, these several sciences are based upon this prior science and refer back to it. Let the geometer state that if four magnitudes are proportional, they will also be proportional alternately, and prove it by his own principles, which the arithmetician would not use. And again, let the arithmetician lay it down in that if four numbers are proportional, they will also be proportional alternately, and establish this from the starting point of his own science. Then whose function is it to know the principle of alternation alike in magnitude and in numbers, and the principle governing the division of compound magnitudes and numbers and the compounding of separate ones? It cannot be that we have sciences of particular areas of being and knowledge of them, but have no single science of immaterial objects that stand much closer to intellectual inspection. Knowledge of those objects is by far the prior science, and from it the several sciences get their common propositions, our knowledge ascending from the more partial to the more general until at last we reach the science of being as being. This science does not consider its province to study the properties that belong intrinsically to numbers, nor those that are common to all quantities. Rather, it contemplates that single form of being or existence that belongs to all things, and for this reason, it is the most inclusive of all sciences, all of which derive their principles from it. Always it is the higher sciences that provide the first hypothesis for the demonstrations of the sciences below them, and the most perfect of sciences out of its own store lends to all others their principles, the more general principles to some, and to others less general ones. That's why Socrates in the Theaetetus, mingling play with seriousness, likens the forms of knowledge in us to doves. Some of them, he says, fly in droops, and others separate from the rest. The more comprehensive and general sciences contain many many special sciences in themselves, whereas those that handle generically distinct objects remain apart and have little to do with one another because they start from first principles. One science, however, must stand above the many sciences and branches of knowledge. That's science which knows the common principles that pervade all kinds of being and furnishes to all the mathematical sciences their starting points. Here let us end our remarks about the highest science. Next, let us see what faculty it is that pronounces judgment in mathematics. On this doctrine, let us follow the guidance of Plato. In the Republic, he sets on one side the objects of knowledge and over against the forms of knowing, and pairs the forms of knowing with types of knowable things. Some things he posits as intelligibles, others as perceptibles, and then he makes a further distinction among intelligibles between intelligibles and understandables, and among perceptibles between perceptibles and likeness. To the intelligibles, the highest of the four classes, he assigns intellection as its mode of knowing. To the understandables, understanding. I'll read that paragraph again. Proclus is exploring what faculty it is that pronounces judgment in mathematics. So till this point, Proclus has placed mathematics as a study of what is between the absolute and the myriad forms that are perceived outside. Because mathematics has a set of perceptible principles which are felt, it is different from an indivisible reality that the so-called intellect would find as indivisible, at least. So he places the so till now this particular author has placed mathematics between the study of the indivisible, that is what is indivisible to the intellect, and below that and above the study of myriad forms. Because it has a set of knowable principles, it has to be less than the unknowable indivisible, so-called, is what the author says. And that definitely makes sense. Now the topic is the faculty. Now next we should see what faculty it is that pronounces judgment in mathematics. On this doctrine, let us again follow the guidance of Plato. In the Republic, he sets on one side the objects of knowledge and over against them the forms of knowing, and pairs the forms of knowing with the types of knowable things. Some things he posits as intelligibles, others as perceptibles, and then he makes further distinction among intelligibles between intelligibles and understandables, among the perceptibles between perceptibles and likeness. To the intelligibles, the highest of the four classes, he assigns intellection as it is the mode of knowing. To the understandables, understanding. Perceptibles, belief, and to likeness, conjecture. That is, in a sense, epic, because here, I guess what he means by intelligibles is what is understood in the deepest, most profoundest sense. Perception are patterns that rest on the intelligibles plane. So intelligibles, others as so you have intelligibles and perceptibles. Among intelligibles, there is intelligibles and understandables. That is also profound. Perhaps, there has to be a moment between what that particular awareness cognizes and is able to cognize in a codified sense, which would be understanding. In a codifiable sense, perhaps I could put it that way. And then you have perceptibles and likeness. Perceptibles, we'll read, perceptibles must be related to the world perception that rests on the intelligibles class. He assigns intellection as it is a mode of knowing to understandables understanding to perceptibles belief and to likeness conjecture. He shows that conjecture has a relation to perception that understanding has to intellection. Conjecture has a relation to perception that understanding has to intellect. Understanding has to intellection. Yeah, this makes sense because conjecture, you're making a conjecture out of what is perceived in the world. The perception does not carry the full codified picture of what is perceived. You make a conjecture based on that. Likewise, in the inner sense, in the inner movement, you get into the intelligibles, and then there emerges the codifiable aspects of it, which are the understandables. He shows that conjecture has the relation to perception that understanding has to intellection. For conjecture apprehends the images of sense objects in water or other reflecting surfaces, which as they are really only images of images, occupy almost the lowest rank in the scale of things, while understanding studies the likeness of intelligibles that have descended from the primary simple and indivisible forms into plurality and division. Studies the likeness of intelligibles that have descended from primary simple and indivisible forms into plurality and division. An intelligible that has emerged has that it is difficult to put into words, but my guess is, first of all, an intelligible is not an indivisible, but its origination is in a plane where you cannot, the average awareness cannot distinguish them as existent. If it were purely indivisible, nothing could emerge from it. So it definitely has aspects. So from that plane, okay, I had to pause because of my pet dog, Babu. Symphony. Um, he shows that conjecture has the relation to perception that understanding has to intellection. That is obvious. For conjecture apprehends the images of sense objects in water, just as I had earlier said. For this reason, I'm skipping a sentence that I earlier read. While understanding studies the likeness of intelligibles that have descended from the primary, simple, and indivisible forms into plurality and division. This can be understood in two ways. For one, an indivisible cannot descend into plurality. If it is actually an indivisible, in the sense of perception, the notion of divisibility has to arise by alteration of views. Different views of it generate different meaning senses. But again, then the question arises, what perceives the meaning senses? It has to be situated beyond the meaning generator view thing. So then again, what is beyond this view generation is not indivisible in that sense. One might also think about what the word indivisible there means actually. Anyway, and also see, fundamental to mathematics is perceptions and operations. So is there an indivisible wholeness to the sense of operation and perception, and to perception, operator perception? Is that somehow indivisibly bound? Are we seeing views of a whole thing separated out by a machine that allows us to hold geometries of this multifold perception generating geometry thing? Whatever, you get the idea. If you don't, at least it's better than Proclus. Slightly clear, I hope. So where were we? This is getting nowhere. I'm wondering how long it will take to read the whole thing. For this reason, knowledge that understanding has is dependent on other and prior hypothesis, whereas intellection attains to the hypothetical principle itself. Intellection is resting there, while understanding is drawing from there. And again, there is, just as outward perception conjecture, there is a conjecturing process on what is innately intellectual, by the innate intellect known. In ancient Sanskrit traditions, there's the concept of buddhi. So that principle. So the buddhi is pondering the geometrical views, and the merging into a wholeness, the separation into plurality, all driven by operators. So the operators are the binds and the separator view generators of this whole so-called undivided. You could argue that way. And what about the operators themselves? Are they somehow undivided and the view of the same thing? We'll have to ponder that. So it's a good question to spark the awareness with. I'll just spend a few moments putting it in my brain by thinking about it, and then I'll continue reading. A few seconds, maybe 20 seconds. Like, assume you have three fundamental operators, but these three fundamental operators are different views of the same meaning generation artifact. Meaning is generated by holding a vector. Meaning is generated when a vector is absorbed, unveiling a higher order vector. Meaning is generated in the projection of a vector. Meaning is generated in the simultaneous holding of superpositioned holding of vectors. You might hear some noises from outside. And meaning is generated in a kind of, so the projection rejection process becomes a little like the powers and roots. The superpositioning is like addition of quantum vectors. The addition operator needs more thought. Is it definitely when we are perceiving different objects together, we say we can add them together, put them together. So there is a sense of superpositioning of what bears likeness, perceptibles and likeness. The term arises there. So let's forget in the sense, keep aside the question of from where the sense of likeness arises, to understanding this particular thing. How does this and the operator, is there one whole operator manifesting as different operators, allowing for? So instead of the term operator, one could introduce the term perception holder or perception binder. perception binder. This perception binder has three functional aspects to its whole. One is a superpositioning aspect, the other is a kind of multiplication is seen in quantum physics, wave function multiplication, and for that and for the reason that the awareness has access to the notion of multiplication, I hold that in the understanding of the intelligible sense, that there's a multiplication aspect to this form binder which has a meaning of its own. So one has to ponder the meaning generated by these binding forms and the perception generated by these binding forms. So we are dealing with one whole meaning binder artifact, or the perception sense binder artifact, which manifests differently as this particular mathematical artifact, universal mathematical artifact, is held in different senses. So we could take the universal mathematical artifact as a whole. Yet again, to say something is indivisible doesn't make a very profound sense, or at least a view generator of it had to emerge from it. That becomes divisible. So where did this mathematical view generator emerge from if the origin is so-called indivisible? And now assuming there is a very underlying something that is indivisible, which was not involved in this particular mathematical generation, and that is what endows the sense of space and meaning. And its meaning and spatial sense is altered through the geometry of the mathematical artifact, then this makes sense. So the view is a function of the operators and the number spaces vectors. Okay, let's go forward. Intellection attains the unhypothetical principle. Intellection attains the unhypothetical principle itself. So that's the goal. We are just talking right now, but ultimately the goal is to attain to the unhypothetical principle itself. Since therefore mathematical objects have the status neither of what is partless and exempt from all division and diversity, nor of what is apprehended by perception and is highly changeable, it is in every way divisible. It is obvious that they are essentially understandables, and that understanding is the faculty that is set over them, as perception is over sense objects and conjecture is over likeness. And the state is neither of what is partless and exempt from all division and diversity, nor of what is apprehended by perception and is highly changeable and in every way divisible. It is obvious that they are essentially understandables, and that understanding is the faculty that is set over them, just as I earlier said, but of course with the flavor in which Proclus is speaking with his own ideas, flavor and sense and whatever. And perception is over sense objects and conjecture over likeness. And Socrates describes the knowledge of understandables as being more obscure than the highest science, but clearer than the judgments of opinion. For the mathematical sciences are more explicative and discursive than intellectual insight, but are superior to opinion in the stability and irrefutability of their ideas. Their proceeding from hypothesis makes them inferior to the highest knowledge, while their occupation with immaterial objects makes their knowledge more perfect than sense perception. The mathematical sciences tend to be more explicative and discursive than intellectual insight. But an ultimate mathematics is when the understanding becomes one with the intellectual faculty, intellect that is described here, intellectual insight. So that buddhi yoga. I just yawned. The buddhi yoga principle is here. So let's think of the buddhi as an indivisible plane in which both the mathematical artifact, purely mathematical artifact, and its view are situated. And their proceeding from hypothesis makes them inferior to the highest knowledge, while their occupation with immaterial objects makes their knowledge more perfect than sense perception. Such then is the criterion of judgment in all mathematics as we have delineated it according to Plato's thought, the understanding of faculty higher in rank than opinion, but inferior to intellect. Next, we must ascertain what being can fittingly be ascribed to mathematical genera and species. Should we admit that they are derived from sense objects either by abstraction as is commonly said, or by collection from particulars to one common definition, or should we rather assign to them an existence prior to sense objects as Plato demands, and as the processional order of things indicates? In the first place, if we say that mathematical forms are derived from sense objects, that the soul, from seeing material circles and triangles, afterwards shapes in herself the form of circle and form of triangle, whence come the exactness and certainty that belong to our ideas. Consider from sense objects. The soul of from seeing from material circles and triangles, afterwards comes in exactness and necessity belonging to our ideas. So there is a question of from where the geometrical perception ultimately arises. There's a question of if these geometrical forms inherently exist or somehow it is derived from. Since I believe the circle and the end sphere and the end square are inherent. So are reflection planes in them and so forth. So triangles might have its origin some in different senses. One sense is related to projections and spins. Hence come the exactness and certainty that belong to ideas. So necessarily either from sense objects or from the soul, but they cannot come from sense objects, for there would be far more precision in sense objects than there is, of course. They come therefore from the soul, which adds perfection to the imperfect sensibles and accuracy to their impreciseness. Which adds perfection to imperfect sensibles. For where among sensible things do we find anything that is without parts, or without breadth, or without depth? Where do we see the equality of lines from this center to circumference? Where the fixed ratios of the sides? Where the rightness of angles? Do we not see that all sensible things are confused with one another, and that no quantity in them is pure and free of its opposite, but that all are divisible and extended and changing? Then how can we explain that very stability which unchangeable ideas have there if they are derived from things that are ever changing from one state to another? For it is admitted that anything which results from changing beings receives from them a changeable character. And how can we get the exactness of our precise and irrefutable concepts from things that are not precise? For whatever yields knowledge that is steadfast has that quality itself in greater degree. We must therefore posit the soul as the generatrix of mathematical forms and ideas. That's not an inaccurate way of saying it. But what are the fundamental artifacts of perception available to the soul? Is it every geometric form? There must be an atomicity to it, which is why I say the n square also includes the line and the dot, right? When it becomes one-dimensional, zero-dimensional. And if we say that the soul produces them by having their patterns in her own essence, and these offsprings are the projections of forms previously existing in her, then we shall be in agreement with Plato and have found the truth with regard to mathematical being. And if, on the other hand, she weaves this enormous immaterial fabric and gives birth to such an imposing science without knowing or having previously known these ideas, how can she judge whether the offspring she bears are fertile or windex, or whether they are not phantoms instead of truth? What canons could she use for measuring the truths in them? How could she even produce such a varied mass of ideas without having their essence in herself? For thus we should be making their standard come about by chance without any standard. If therefore mathematical forms are products of the soul, and ideas of things that the soul produces are not derived from sense objects, mathematicals are their projections, and the soul's travail and her offspring are manifestations of eternal forms abiding in her. Can be reduced to vectors and spin. Those are those are the possible senses that this artifact allows the awareness. This mathematical artifact allows the awareness. It's possible for it to construct, say, a triangular perception and so forth. And as for the argument that we cannot construct purely geometric things without the notion of a purely straight line with with only length and no breadth. In a 1D space, that is only what can exist. So this particular artifact allows for dimensional breakdowns and dimensional constructions. In the second place, if we collect our ideas in mathematical form, the lower world of sense objects, must we not say that the demonstrations using terms from the sense world are better than those based on more general and simpler forms? Sorry if we said, I'll just pause now. I'm going to take a break. Sleepy. Falling asleep.